Welcome to the Churchill Archives Centre. My name's Alan Packwood and I'm lucky enough to be the director here. Under normal circumstances, I would be bringing you up in small groups and showing you some of the treasures from our collections. Unfortunately, these aren't normal times and I'm not able to welcome you in person, but we're still able to do the tour virtually. The Archive Centre has some 700 collections. The personal papers of politicians, diplomats, military leaders, scientists and social activists of the 20th century and the modern era. And my colleagues have helped me make a selection for you this afternoon. And I hope that this selection will give you an idea of the range of our holdings and the types of material that you find within them. Okay, so let the tour begin. And we start here with a document relating to Churchill, in fact, a document kept by Churchill. This is a special request for my good friend Michael Norridge, who I believe is watching from New York. But what is it? Well, if we look at the document, we can see that it's most secret, the designation that the British used instead of top secret during the Second World War. We can also see that it's copy number 1, but number 1 of what? Well, we look here and you can see that it is the draft of a joint declaration, but not just any declaration. This is the first draft. This is copy number 1 of the Atlantic Charter, the document that was produced by President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at their first wartime meeting in August 1941, and which became the founding charter of the United Nations and outlined the principles for which the Allies were fighting. Freedom from fear, freedom of the seas, the right to choose your own government. A hugely significant document, and one which was clearly recognised as being important by Churchill because he had it framed and put on his study wall at Chartwell, which is why it now appears in this slightly faded form. But of course it was also a controversial document for Churchill because he was promising here freedom to choose your own form of government, but the question was immediately raised, did that apply to India? Did that apply to the colonies of the British Empire? Questions were raised about Churchill's imperialism and his views on race immediately after the broadcast of this charter, and of course they're still being raised today. The Churchill Archives Centre is about preserving the whole record. It's about encouraging and stimulating debate, and that's why it's so important that we keep records like this to act as starting points for that discussion. The wartime meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, which spawned this charter, was of course hugely significant. The first time they had met during war, and what we have here is Churchill's photograph album from that occasion, the album that was presented to him. And here you can see President Roosevelt arriving on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales, supported by his son, because of course Roosevelt couldn't walk unaided. And down below here you see the sailors of the British and the American navies gathered together for divine service on Sunday the 10th of August 1941 on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales. To Churchill, this was an incredibly powerful symbolic moment. He'd been working really hard to try and bring the United States into the conflict, famously remarking that no lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt. And here, their first face-to-face meeting, he's attempting to create an atmosphere of Allied unity, and the creation of the Atlantic Charter has to be seen in that context. The images here are given added poignancy by the fact, of course, that the Prince of Wales, the ship that had carried Churchill over to Newfoundland, is sunk just 4 months later off the coast of Malaysia, and that most of the sailors that you see in these ranks here perish on that future occasion. So a very moving image, both in terms of the time, but also with the benefit of hindsight. Well, couldn't bring you to the Churchill Archives Centre and not show you an original Churchill speech. And they don't get much more famous than this, because what I have in front of me here are Churchill's original speaking notes for the speech that he gave on the 5th of March 1946 at Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri. A speech where he talked about the dangers of Soviet expansionism and warned that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. He was there as a guest of President Truman, and for Churchill, this marked his return to the international stage after his defeat in the 1945 general election. The great thing when you look at the original speaking notes is the way in which Churchill has set them out. They're set out on the page like poetry, in this blank verse format that his office called speech form. And you can see why he does this when you look at the text on the page. Because of course what it does is it gives him the pauses, it gives him the rhythm, it gives him the emphasis. Churchill was an orator who prepared extremely thoroughly and carefully. But it was only fairly recently that we were able to see how carefully he prepared this particular speech. Because just a few years ago, we received from the estate of Sir Martin Gilbert, the late Churchill biographer, some of the notes, the drafts for the Iron Curtain speech, which had become mixed up with his papers. And when you look at these, you can see how Churchill worked, and they give you a real insight into his thought process, into the way in which he crafted his oratory. The way Churchill worked is that he would dictate. The duty secretary would take down his words with a state-of-the-art silent typewriter and then pass the typescript back to Churchill for him to annotate. And here you can see that he has been through these drafts several times, here using both a red pen and a blue pen to make changes, corrections, annotations. And it's fascinating to look at these and to see what they tell you about the way in which Churchill is crafting this speech. So when you look at the final speaking notes, you can see that in the end he decided to go with a joke at the opening, making light of the fact that he is glad to come to Westminster College because the name Westminster was somehow familiar to him. He has reached that point after quite a lot of work. His original introductions here are much more complicated. It is also an honour, perhaps almost unique, for a private visitor to the United States to be introduced to an academic audience by the President of the United States amid his heavy burdens, duties and responsibilities. So you can see how he's simplified things and how he's gone for the joke and the laugh right at the beginning. You can also see here that he has taken out a reference that he was going to make to the American Civil War, based on the fact that Jefferson Davis had been welcomed to Westminster College. And he removes the whole passage, clearly realising that the Civil War was perhaps a subject still too sensitive for the US audience. But when you get into the real substance of the speech, you can see that him also thinking about the whole question of Russia and how to deal with Russia. And again, he struck out a whole passage here about British relations with Russia and goodwill during the Second World War. He struck that out, and he's chose to focus obviously on the Iron Curtain and the challenge facing the world today. Of course, within the archives, we don't just have the speech notes, but we also have a lot of the related correspondence, including the original invitation for Churchill to deliver the speech at Westminster College, which reveals, of course, why he was so keen to go there, why he was so keen to accept, because the invitation has been annotated at the bottom, and there's this handwritten codicil which reads, "This is a wonderful school in my home state. Hope you can do it. I'll introduce you. Best regards, Harry Truman." So the reason, of course, that Churchill goes to Fulton, Missouri is it gives him an opportunity of seeing the president, travelling with the president, being introduced by the president, and he knows that if he goes, he will have the eyes of the world's media upon him. So this is an excellent way of relaunching himself on the world stage. It won't surprise you to know that the Churchill papers are an enormous collection. His own personal archive runs to 2,500 boxes, about 1 million items. Everything from his childhood letters and school reports through to his final writings. But of course, that's only part of the story here, because we've been able to gather around Churchill the papers of his contemporaries, the people he worked with, some of the people who worked for him, some of the people who opposed him. And we also have the papers of many of his family members who were, of course, able to observe him at close quarters and were able to see the private man behind the public figure. And a few years ago, we took in the papers of Mary Soames, Churchill's youngest daughter, and an honorary fellow of Churchill College, sadly no longer with us. And her papers include her wartime diaries. Now, when the war started, she was a girl of just 17, but she had to grow up very, very fast, and it wasn't long before she was accompanying her father on some of his key wartime visits. She attended the Quebec conference and met President Roosevelt. She was at Potsdam with Truman and Stalin. But she also saw action in her own right, signing up with the Auxiliary Territorial Services and becoming an officer on one of the guns defending London and then Europe. And the great thing is that Mary kept a diary all of the way through the Second World War. And this, I think, will be one of the last great wartime diaries to be published. And we are working at the moment with Mary's daughter Emma and with a publishing house to actually bring this into the public domain. But I thought you would like a sneak preview today. So what we're looking at here is Mary's diary for Thursday, the 26th of July, 1945, which was, of course, a particularly dramatic moment for the Churchill family, because it was the day on which Churchill lost the 1945 general election. And Mary was there, and she was a witness to his reaction within Downing Street. So you can see here, it reads, "We went in, Papa, David Margeson, Brendan, and the results rolling in. Labour gain, Labour gain, Labour gain. It was 1 o'clock, and already it was quite certain we were defeated. I watched Papa taking it, grasping defeat, savouring the humiliation. Every minute brought news of more friends out." So here you can literally see in these diaries history unfolding before you. And of course, the great thing is that often we will have different perspectives on these events. So you'll be able to compare Mary Solmes's diary with that of Jock Colville, Winston Churchill's private secretary, or that of Alexander Cadogan, the Under Secretary of State in the Foreign Office. And what that does is allow researchers to build up a picture of what happened from multiple perspectives, different angles. And of course, it's not just about Churchill, it's not just about politicians, and it's certainly not just about men. We have a huge range of collections within the Archives Centre, and what we have here are the papers of an extremely prominent and famous female scientist. Churchill College was founded to train future generations of technologists, scientists and engineers. And so from the beginning, alongside the political collections, we have always collected scientific papers. And what we're looking at here is Rosalind Franklin's scientific notebook for 1953. And of course, 1953 was the year of the big breakthrough in DNA. She was in London while Crick and Watson were in Cambridge, but her notebook gives wonderful insights into her thought process, into her research, and shows how close she was getting to a double helical structure of DNA. So, like the speech notes, the value of a notebook like this is that it plunges you back into the moment, strips away the layers of hindsight, and allows you to go temporarily inside Rosalind Franklin's head and to give you a real insight into her thinking. We also have a lot of documents that shed light on the environment in which she was working. We have the papers of the scientist Aaron Klug, a Nobel Prize winner in his own right, who worked with Rosalind Franklin on the tobacco mosaic virus after she'd finished her work on DNA. And his papers include this wonderful account of the working conditions at Birkbeck when they were working on tobacco mosaic virus. So you can see, it says here, the X-ray tubes were down in the basement, and sometimes the condensation on the pipes resulted in drops of water falling from the ceiling. And I have a vivid picture of Rosalind sitting under an umbrella, carrying out the delicate operations for setting a tobacco mosaic virus camera. So, insights into what it was like to conduct that research. And we have a photograph of the laboratory at Birkbeck here. For those of you who are interested in knowing more about Rosalind Franklin and her work, you can access her archive online through the website of the Wellcome Foundation. And my colleague Madeline Evans has also put together a wonderful online display which you can see on our website to mark the recent centenary of Rosalind's birth. And flowing on from Rosalind Franklin, it's not just scientists, but also social scientists and social activists and campaigners whose papers you will find within the Archives Centre. These were people who were not necessarily part of the mainstream establishment, not part of the Whitehall machine, but yet able to affect huge change at both national and local levels. And there are two examples of collections that I want to highlight here that are currently being worked on by my colleague Sophie Bridges. And she has played a key role in helping us build up our social science collections. What we have here are some notes by Michael Young. Michael Young is probably best known to most of you as the man who was involved in founding initiatives for wider education, so like the Open University and the National Extension College, and for championing consumers' rights by founding the Consumers Association. Featured here are the original field notes for Michael's research about working class migration from Bethnal Green in the East End of London to Debden, an Essex housing estate. They were the basis of his PhD and then of the book that he co-authored with Peter Wilmot called Family and Kinship in East London, published in 1957, which was a hugely influential publication and which argued strongly for the importance of maintaining existing working class communities and family structures. And what's interesting about these files is that it was thought that none of the original survey notes had survived. And yet we were able to find a few in an accession which came in a few years ago from the Young Foundation. So these are of incredible interest to social historians, both as a means of studying the communities that Michael Young was serving, but also for the insights that they provide into his methodology and into his work. Because John Lawrence, who used to be here in Cambridge, now at Exeter University, has used these notes to show that some of the conclusions reached by Young and Wilmot were not necessarily supported by all of the evidence that they gathered. And next to Michael Young, we have the papers of Margaret J, Peggy J. She was a long-serving Labour councillor in London, so you have the London link between the two collections. But she was also a great campaigner. She was the author, the chair of the J Report into mental handicap, nursing and care in 1979. And you can see here Barbara Castle congratulating her on producing that report. And she was someone who campaigned on health issues, including children's healthcare and children's hospitals. And health links to this final exhibit here, which is from the papers of Margaret Thatcher. My colleague Andrew Riley has been cataloguing these papers. And what you see here are a series of files from August 1989 relating to prime ministerial visits and engagements. And of course, these survive not just for this period, but for the whole of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, providing a wealth of information. But the one that I've selected here relates to a visit that she paid in August 1989 to the Mildmay Mission Hospital in London. Again, linking it back to the Peggy J and Michael Young material. And the Mildmay Mission Hospital was treating AIDS patients. And this was a private visit paid by the Prime Minister. You can see her briefing notes here, where she has underlined key points with her blue pen. And on the right here, you've got her preparation for the visit, but here on the left, you've got a note prepared by her private secretary, Caroline Slowcock, bringing her up to date shortly afterwards and reporting the very sad and tragic news that the 2 AIDS patients that Margaret Thatcher had seen on her visit had since died. This visit clearly moved Margaret Thatcher. She sent a personal financial donation to the mission without any publicity. So I suppose what it illustrates for me, in a way, is that there is always a personal side to our material. We collect personal papers, and there is always that juxtaposition, that contrast between the official record, the official position, and here you have someone who was famous as the Iron Lady, who was known for a rather hard-nosed approach to policy. Here I think you see a slightly different side to her through this visit. So I've completed my walk around the table, 7 examples, 7 sets of documents from different collections, which hopefully capture and illustrate the range of material that is available for researchers within the Archive Centre here. From Churchill to Thatcher and now beyond, from international relations to science and social sciences. The real strength of the Archive Centre is the body of interrelated material that has been assembled and captured under one roof. And our mission is a very simple one. It's to preserve it so that it's here not just for us now today, but for future generations, but it's also to make it as widely available and accessible as possible. When our reading rooms reopen, our hope is that anyone will be able to make an appointment to come and visit and to undertake research. But we're also now looking harder than ever at ways in which we can take this material to a wider audience. The Churchill papers have been digitised, working with the commercial publisher Bloomsbury. Margaret Thatcher's papers have largely been digitised, and a selection is freely available through the Margaret Thatcher Foundation website. Rosalind Franklin's papers are, as I said, available through the Wellcome Trust website. And we will be looking for other strategic partnerships, other opportunities to digitise more and more of the information in our care and to make that available remotely. We're also very keen to support the wider exhibition of our material, and we're determined to continue to collect and to build the archive and the Archive Centre here.